Hello again, everyone. I apologize that you can't see me in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, but I'm having some technical difficulties with the integrated camera here. But that's okay, we'll try to get that fixed by next week. I just wanted to go through with you folks the next assignment. And the next assignment is going to be a rhetorical analysis. So hopefully by this point you have taken a look at the rhetoric and writing PowerPoint and the video that I recorded previously. Taken some stock of some of the things that are there. And what I'm going to do is in this video introduce you to the assignment, and then the next video give you some practice. We'll watch an actual video, an actual advertisement together, and I'll point out a couple of things, maybe discuss how you could potentially talk about that. So again, under our course, under the assignment sheet section, for paper number 2, you should have the assignment sheet here. And so some of this should look familiar, right? The description is just that description that's in the syllabus that we have there. And then, of course, the little diagram here was in the rhetoric and writing PowerPoint. But just to go through some of these things in brief, again, the description, this is a short paper. It's a little bit longer, perhaps, than the last paper, right, of approximately 4 to 5 pages, where you can choose an article from the assigned readings or use online research. And so there is going to be a research component to this. So you can take something that's a selection from our textbook to help support your analysis, or you can go out and find some selection, some online article, and I can tell you what those might be in a few minutes here. But you're going to incorporate those things in some way, again, to support your analysis of some form of popular culture that you choose. And I give a couple of examples. So you really would just select one of these things. So it could be a political cartoon that you choose to look at. Examples of places to look for that would be Time Magazine, U.S. News World Report, the New York Times. You could find versions from those online. Any advertisement is great for this assignment. You can find tons of them on the web, but also, if you look at magazines like Cosmopolitan or Men's Health or Rolling Stone, clips from films, not an entire film, so something like a 20-minute clip or maybe less from, a movie that you enjoy. I list a couple of them there that could be useful. A documentary, a television program, again, shorter television program, a half-hour program is generally best, or music lyrics. And the trick to this is that one of those things that you select should have some element of it that's grappling with a social issue, so something that's maybe currently being debated as far as a social issue. So that's the gist of the assignment, and then again we have our little rhetorical triangle / diagram here, again of our communicator, what that means, audience, message, how everything exists within a cultural, social, political, economic context, and how we go about doing that through language and use of symbols. So to give you more specifics on the requirements. So this paper essentially asks you to use, again, some form of popular culture to examine that complex interplay between communicators, audiences, messages, use of language and symbols, and those larger contexts under which all of those things operate. So unlike your first essay, which was narrative-based, this paper requires a little more structure and for you to make some kind of a definitive claim, so a thesis of some sort. So you're not going to word it this way, but basically asking yourself, okay, in this paper I will what? What are you going to do? What are you going to try to prove, right? You're going to conduct an analysis, but what is it that you found in your analysis, okay? And so to give you an example of that, we're going to look at this example of the Dove Beauty campaign in a second, but primarily through the use of time-lapse videography. The Dove Beauty campaign promotes self-esteem by dispelling the beauty myth that is thrust upon women in American society. However, Dove's credibility is questionable, especially considering that their parent company promotes products, such as Axe body spray, that perpetuate the exploitation of women. So you're doing this analysis and you're using rhetoric as a lens. So you talk about who's the communicator, who's the intended audience, how are these folks trying to persuade me to essentially buy their product in the case of an advertisement. And so you talk about all those things, those component parts, but you have to stake some kind of a claim, right? Not just the advertisement is successful or unsuccessful, though that might be part of your thesis, right? But how is it successful and where might it contradict? And you're trying to prove those things as you go along. Okay. Now, as far as organizing this, several students have organized it in the past when I've done this by devoting a single paragraph or a series of paragraphs to each aspect of the rhetorical triangle. So you might talk about logos in one set of paragraphs, pathos in another, ethos, etc. But that might not always be the best structure, because one thing is that all of these elements of the rhetorical triangle kind of overlap. The way that a message is conveyed and the devices that are used, thinking about logos right there, is usually indicative of who the audience is. Who are we trying to target this for? So that's one thing. There might be some blending there. You might combine some of those elements. You might begin by simply asking yourself a series of questions, similar to the ones that we've discussed in terms of reading or analysis or the things that we found in the textbook, right? And go from there. So one thing you might just ask, you're going to, of course, try to find something first that is of interest of you, something that you want to write about and want to analyze, and then it's just picking it apart and maybe asking yourself these questions as you watch it or view it or look at it over and over again. So who is the author of this piece? What credibility do they have? What right do they have to try to convey this type of message to me? What do I know about them? And that might also be a point where you need to do some more research. So that could be an online article that you try to find. How is the piece arranged? What do you think the author, why do you think the author chose to arrange the piece this way, right? If you're looking at a still advertisement, for example, and your eye is immediately drawn to the bottom left-hand corner of the page. Well, why is that? Is text being used in some kind of interesting way? Is there a specific kind of color that's happening? So again, try to account for those things. Which of the rhetorical appeals, logos, ethos, or pathos, is the most dominant? How do these appeals strengthen or weaken the message that the author is trying to convey? What are the weaknesses in the piece? How do those weaknesses affect how you respond to the work? Because again, you could potentially be an audience member for this, but then again, it might not strike you, so maybe you're actually not an intended audience member. So that's one thing to consider too. What are the strengths of the piece? What did you find particularly interesting and insightful and just kind of jumped out at you? What features are the most prominent or important in the piece? So is humor being used in some kind of way? Is there rhythm in terms of if you're looking at music or lyrics or even words, right? There's rhythm in our language. Repetition, color schemes, camera angles, music, etc. Right? One example that I always give students is that say you're analyzing a scene from a horror movie, okay, and it's the scene where someone's running through the woods and the serial killer or whatever is chasing after them, and the person inevitably trips and falls, and then all of a sudden the camera goes and looks up and pans up into the face of the killer, right, as they're about to strike the victim, right? That camera angle specifically puts you in the perspective of that potential victim, which is then supposed to elicit an emotional response in you of being more fearful, right? Of identifying with that particular character and the terror and the fear that they have. So that's what we mean when we say, okay, how is a particular feature being used? That's an element of logos, right? An element of logos, the camera angle, to get you to, as an audience member, feel something, which is pathos, right? How effective is the piece as a whole at conveying its message? What has made it effective or not? And is there anything being conveyed that is maybe not so obvious? So as I mentioned, you'll be required to use 2 valid online sources to support your analysis, or again, you could use things from the text, right? We just need to have 2 sources that support your analysis in some kind of way. So this can again come from either the databases in the Haley Library, or you can find some things on the internet. And I'll be spending a little bit of time, talking about locating appropriate sources as we go along. Generally, a good rule of thumb is, if you find it through the Haley Library, you're in pretty good shape as far as finding it through the online databases there. If you're just Googling something, you have to be a little wary, right? Because you have to say, okay, well, again, who is this person that's conveying this message to me? What credibility do they have? Are they somebody that's just, spouting off from a soapbox in their personal blog, or are they somebody that's maybe affiliated with an institution, a .edu, kind of a thing, where they have a little bit more stance and credibility and a certain level of credentialing, okay? So again, MLA format, I outlined some of that right here, and the first due date is going to be on Wednesday the 30th, the final draft on the 13th, and then the revision again, our last class will be on the 26th, okay? So that's the long and short of the assignment itself. If you have any specific questions, comments, concerns, as always, feel free to contact me and email me. The next video, we're going to actually look at that Dove Beauty campaign example and talk about some of the things that we might be able to look at if we're going to do a rhetorical analysis of that, okay? So until next time, I will talk to you folks later. Thanks.